What if Paul never converted? Picture a dusty Roman road at noon, heat dancing above the stones, a determined Pharisee named Saul marching north toward Damascus. In our world, a blaze of light interrupts him, a voice calls his name, and everything we know about the church tilts. But what if there's no light, no voice, no sudden blindness, only footsteps, the rattle of gear, and a mission against a small, stubborn movement that calls Jesus Lord? Before we bend history, let's walk the real path. Saul of Tarsus was brilliant, trained under Gamaliel, zealous for the law. He hunted early believers, dragging them from homes, convinced he was protecting Israel's faith. On the road to Damascus, Acts tells us, a heavenly light struck him down. He heard, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Blinded, led into the city, he met Ananias, one of the very people he'd come to seize. Scales fell from his eyes. He was baptized. He ate. And then, as if set on fire, he reversed course. He preached Jesus in synagogues. He argued with scholars. He traveled Antioch, Cyprus, Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia, Ephesus, Corinth, Rome, founding networks of small communities that met in homes, called each other family, and crossed lines of class, gender, and ethnicity. His letters, Romans, Galatians, Corinthians, Philippians, and more, are the oldest Christian writings we have. Earlier than the four Gospels, his pages read like urgent voice notes from the front. They carried theology through ports and marketplaces. Grace, not lineage. Faith that welcomes outsiders. The crucified Messiah as power and weakness. Without Paul, it's hard to picture the church as the church we know. Okay, now we turn the wheel. No light on the Damascus road. Saul keeps walking. He reaches the gates with warrants in his pack and certainty in his chest. Arrests happen quietly. A few leaders are scattered. The movement flinches. What then? At first, maybe very little changes to the Roman eye. The Jesus movement remains tucked inside synagogues, especially among the Greek-speaking Jews of the diaspora. It's not called Christianity yet. It's a way inside a people, bound by Sabbath, festivals, and food laws. Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, anchor the community in Jerusalem. They pray in the temple courts. They tell and retell stories of the resurrection. They share meals and resources. But their reach is mostly Jewish, their language mostly Aramaic and Hebrew, with some Greek where necessary. The question of the age, whether Gentiles can belong without becoming Jews, still rises like a storm on the horizon. But without Paul's thunder, it breaks differently. In our timeline, Paul pushes that storm to a decision. He argues that Gentiles can enter by faith alone, apart from the full yoke of the law. He persuades leaders in Jerusalem. He writes to Galatia, fuming over circumcision controversies, hammering out what will become the scaffolding of Christian identity beyond Israel. Without him, the urgency fades, the debate drifts. Some groups cautiously welcome non-Jews, but they ask for more. Dietary rules respected, calendar observed, pieces of the law kept for unity's sake. Others shut Gentiles out entirely. The movement stays smaller, tighter, harder to enter. Think about geography. Those little names in the back of your mind from Sunday maps. Iconium, Lystra, Thessalonica, Philippi, Corinth. Many of those churches bear Paul's fingerprints. Without him, the map glows differently. Antioch still matters. The first place believers are nicknamed Christians. Barnabas may step forward as a bridge builder. Apollos, eloquent and learned, might preach in Ephesus and Corinth. But without Paul's relentless follow-up letters, disputes linger. One house church avoids meat from idol markets forever. Another compromises to survive. They don't swap letters to harmonize. They don't have a traveling pastor stitching them into a network. The fabric phrase. Theologically, watch the center of gravity shift. Without Paul's voice, the early teachings lean more toward the sayings of Jesus as remembered in oral tradition and then in written gospels. The Sermon on the Mount becomes primary. James's letter, "Faith without works is dead," rises in prominence. The cross remains central, but its meaning is told more as faithful example and less as Paul's sweeping vision of grace overcoming law. The result? A more communitarian, practice-heavy movement where belonging looks and tastes more Jewish for longer. Pause. If the movement feels more Jewish, how do Roman authorities respond? Rome cared less about personal beliefs and more about public order and civic religion. Jewish communities had a carve-out. They could abstain from emperor worship. A Jesus movement nested inside synagogues might inherit some of that protection. That means persecution could be less targeted for a while. But it also means growth is slower, more cautious, and mostly along existing Jewish diaspora lines. The wildfire that leaps across social classes in port cities doesn't ignite with the same heat. Now tilt the lens toward the year 70. The temple in Jerusalem falls to Roman legions. In our world, that shock shapes both Judaism and Christianity. Without Paul's Gentile churches already humming across the Aegean, the Jesus movement feels that quake differently. Jerusalem remains the symbolic heart, and its loss destabilizes more. Some communities double down on practices to preserve identity. Others, especially in places like Alexandria or Antioch, begin to philosophize their faith more quickly, translating Jesus' story into Greek ideas and metaphors. In the vacuum left by Jerusalem's collapse, it's possible that Christianity tilts eastward, a Syriac and Coptic heartland, more desert monastic early, less Latin westward push. Consider the canon. Paul's letters anchor half the New Testament. Remove them, and what fills the shelves? The Gospels still emerge. Mark first, then Matthew and Luke weaving their fuller narratives, John late and poetic. Acts still tells the tale, but it reads very differently. More Peter, more James, more trials in synagogues, less whirlwind of journeys. Other letters rise, but Peter guides suffering communities. James keeps faith grounded. Hebrews, with its temple imagery, offers a bridge to Gentiles through symbol rather than decree. Scripture still forms, but its melody changes key. Fewer sharp statements about grace and law, more sustained emphasis on faithful living, on Jesus' parables, on wisdom. And what of Rome, both the city and the idea? In our timeline, Paul writes to the Romans and longs to visit, to use it as a springboard to Spain. Imagine no such letter, no such plan. If the church in Rome forms primarily through Jewish believers and God-fearing Gentiles attached to synagogues, it may grow, yes, but quieter, slower. When emperors glance at census rolls, Christianity might not yet register as a rising force. So when Constantine surveys his empire in the early 4th century, hungry for a unifying faith, what does he see? Possibly a patchwork of Eastern communities, stronger in Syria and Egypt than in Italy and Gaul. He might still favor Christianity. There were other bishops, other thinkers. But the empire's Christianization becomes an Eastern first story. The Latin West follows later, or differently. Think downstream. Augustine sits in a garden, wrestling with a restless heart. In our history, he hears a child's voice say, "Take and read," and opens to Paul. The words catch fire. Without Paul's letters, what does he open? Maybe Matthew, maybe Psalms. Augustine may still convert, but the theology he builds would lean less on Romans and more on Jesus' teachings or on wisdom literature. The doctrine of grace develops a different texture. Centuries later, when Martin Luther reads Galatians and Romans and hears liberty, that moment shifts too. No Paul, no Luther as we know him. Reform still happens. Corruption and conscience are constants, but it might rally around different grievances and different texts. Perhaps Matthew's demands for radical ethic reform become the banner, not Paul's argument for justification by faith. The Reformation spark could emerge later, spread differently, or even fracture in new ways. At street level, daily life inside the church looks different as well. Picture a coastal market in Corinth. Meat sizzles at a vendor's stall, the smoke curling into the sea air. In our world, Paul counsels believers about meat offered to idols, about conscience, about not causing a brother to stumble. Take away that advice. A young believer glances at the grill and hesitates. No letter arrives to navigate gray areas. Some communities adopt strict rules. No market meet ever, no guild feasts, no compromise. They become poorer, more marginal, more cut off from economic life. Others, lacking shared guidance, take the opposite approach and blend more than they meant to. Tension grows between strict and lax. Without a common voice to arbitrate, fractures widen. Worship rhythm changes too. Sunday, the first day, the day of the resurrection, slowly became the church's special day. Without Paul's liturgical and pastoral presence, Sabbath observance remains central longer. House churches might close their doors on Friday at sundown, open them again with Havdalah spices lifting in Saturday night air. Gentiles who join learn rhythms of calendar and diet because they love the people and want to belong. The mix takes on a particular beauty. Songs in Hebrew and Greek, prayers shaped by the Psalms and by Jesus' table talk. But the distance from pagan neighbors feels greater. Crossing that gap takes longer without a Paul-shaped bridge. Midway through, let's pause and breathe. If this alternate path intrigues you, I'd love to hear your take. Which single change would ripple furthest? No letters or no Gentile mission? Share your thought below. And if respectful, thoughtful what-ifs like this are your thing, tap subscribe so you won't miss the next journey. Back on the road, let's return to the empire. Without Paul's Roman citizenship opening doors and buying time in court, what happens when believers face law and order? It's possible the movement remains under the shield of Jewish exemptions longer. The real break with synagogue life comes gradually, through local disputes over Jesus' identity, not through a fast line drawn by Gentile influx. The label Christian emerges slower, and the legal status as a distinct group comes later. That alters persecution patterns. Instead of empire-wide edicts, you see sporadic local flare-ups. Martyr stories still happen. Conviction makes courage, but their spread is regional, not universal. The faith's growth curves are less dramatic, more like a low, steady tide than a series of waves. Culturally, art and symbol develop with a different accent. Paul's theology of the cross, foolishness to Greeks, stumbling block to Jews, made suffering a site of meaning. Without that particular emphasis, art might center longer on the Good Shepherd, on table fellowship, on miracles and parables. Cruciform architecture still emerges eventually, but more slowly. The fish, the ichthys, remains a quiet sign scratched near doors and on tombs. In hymnody, we hear more beatitudes, fewer paraphrases of Romans 8. Education and monastic life bend differently too. If the church's early strength sits in Syria and Egypt, monasticism becomes the flagship sooner. Desert fathers and mothers shape spirituality for the whole church, not just a stream. That means a contemplative, ascetic ethos saturates worship and daily life earlier, with less of the juridical, legal language that Paul's arguments often inspired. The church becomes a school of prayer before it becomes a drumbeat of doctrine. Not better, not worse, simply different. Fast forward. When Germanic tribes push into the Western Empire, a weaker Latin church means mission fields look different. The conversion of Clovis, the rise of Frankish Christianity, the spread into Celtic lands, all might unfold decades later, or under the guidance of Eastern-leaning missionaries. The Bible that reaches them carries the Gospels and the prophets, letters of Peter and James prominent, without Paul's dense paragraphs to puzzle over by candlelight. Theology forms in monasteries and marketplaces with different anchor texts. The conversations about sin, grace, law, and freedom sing in a new register. But let's not underestimate human ingenuity. Movements find messengers. If Paul is absent, someone else steps forward, though perhaps a generation later. Maybe a rabbi from Alexandria, fluent in Plato and Torah, crafts a new synthesis that invites Gentiles in without heavy burdens. Maybe a woman of means in Corinth becomes the connector, funding teachers and circulating homilies between house churches. Maybe an itinerant artisan named Eustace composes a collection of Jesus' sayings with commentary that becomes the de facto teaching manual across the Mediterranean. History has many hinges. If the Damascus hinge is missing, another might appear, squeaking open a different door. Even so, the timeline shifts. Without Paul, Christianity's core spreads east to west more slowly, emphasizing practice and community cohesion. Rome's conversion comes later or feels less total. The medieval world forms with a church that is less centralized under a bishop of Rome and more federated among patriarchs, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and later Constantinople, carrying equal weight. The East-West dynamics tilt toward conversation rather than collision for a while. When fishers come, they cut along different seams. Now draw breath and step back from the map. Why does this matter? Because Paul's story shows how one life, redirected, can bend rivers. Not because he was flawless. His letters reveal temper, exasperation, tenderness, humor. But because his yes after Damascus multiplied into yeses across half an empire. Our what if reminds us, remove one yes, and the architecture of history rearranges itself. It also protects humility. The world we have was not inevitable. Faith traditions carry contingency in their roots. For believers, that reads as providence. For historians, as delicate chains of cause and effect. For all of us, it's an invitation to wonder, what small decision today becomes a path that cities will someday be built on? Which quiet kindness, which careful argument, which apology written in the night will leave footprints in centuries we'll never see? In the end, whether Paul walked blind into Damascus or marched through with fury, people would still grapple with the same human questions. How do we belong to each other? How do we make peace with guilt and grief? Who is worth a seat at our table? Our scenario suggests that answers can travel by different roads. They can wear different clothes. A church without Paul might have sung softer songs at first, might have welcomed the nations more slowly, might have learned to say grace with different words. But the hunger for meaning, for mercy, for a love that outlasts empires, that hunger would remain. So we close on that quiet road again, the heat trembling, the horizon wavering. In one world, a light falls, and a voice calls a persecutor by name. In another, footsteps never break stride, and history takes the long way around. Either way, the story reminds us to look for the hinge moments, to honor the fragile power of a single turning, and to treat the present as the seedbed of futures we cannot yet imagine.